Hey everyone. Tonight we plunge into a sea of shattered walls and frozen corpses, where the air itself feels like shards of ice slicing your lungs. You won't hear heroic trumpet calls here, only the crack of distant shells tearing open the night, the wet thud of a body sliding off a broken beam, and the low moan of men too starved to cry out. This isn't about textbook tactics. It's about the relentless grind of Stalingrad's frozen hell, where hunger gnaws your bones raw, artillery fire turns buildings to ash, and every step could be your last. If you crave unflinching tales of humanity at its breaking point, hit like and subscribe. And in the comments, let me know where are you watching from, and what memory of sheer winter terror still haunts you now. Steel yourself against the cold glow of your screen and follow me into the city of ghosts. You remember the summer of '41, a time when the world seemed to unfurl before you like a crisp, new map. Operation Barbarossa, they called it. A name that promised swift, decisive movement, a relentless sweep across vast, open lands. You were part of a tide, a human wave that seemed unstoppable. Day after day, the dust of the Russian plains clung to your uniform. The rumble of your boots echoed across endless fields, and the scent of distant victory was almost tangible. The sun beat down, warming your skin, and the landscape, though unfamiliar, held a certain stark beauty. There was a sense of purpose, a shared belief that this relentless drive would bring a swift conclusion. You pressed forward, mile after mile, capturing millions of Soviet prisoners, a testament to the speed and power of your advance. Yet, as autumn began to paint the leaves in fiery hues, a subtle chill crept into the air, and with it, a creeping realization. Moscow, the grand prize, remained just beyond your grasp. That initial momentum, that thrilling, effortless surge, began to slow, encountering an unexpected resilience in the vastness of this land. Then came the bitter winter of '41, a cold unlike any you had known. Breath left your lips in icy plumes. The ground, once yielding, hardened into an impenetrable slab of frozen earth. Machinery groaned, men shivered, and the dream of a quick triumph receded into the biting winds. But as the pale, hesitant sun of spring 1942 began to melt the snows, a new wave of optimism washed over the ranks. The world seemed to sigh, releasing its icy grip, and a new energy stirred. You saw fresh faces, new recruits arriving, their eyes bright with a hope that mirrored your own. The rumble of transport trucks, laden with new weapons and supplies, became a comforting symphony, whispers of a renewed offensive, grander and more decisive than before, passed through the camp like a warming breeze. You felt a quiet anticipation, a belief that this time, the true, final push would begin. But the grand strategy had shifted, unbeknownst to many of you in the field. From the highest command, a new directive filtered down, reshaping the very contours of your destiny. Moscow is off. The quiet murmur began. We strike south. This was Fall Blau, a massive operation aimed not at the heart of the Soviet Union's political power, but at its very lifeblood, the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial heartland along the Don River. You heard the names spoken, unfamiliar at first, then growing in significance: Voronezh, Kharkov, Maikop, Grozny, Baku. And then, a new name began to echo with increasing frequency: Stalingrad. A city on the Volga, an industrial hub, a symbol. You were part of Army Group South, a formidable force, and the plan unfolded in 4 distinct phases. First, the push towards Voronezh, then the link-up at Kharkov, creating a vast pincer movement. After that, the long, grinding artillery siege of Stalingrad, a city whose very name would soon be etched into the depths of your memory. And finally, the ultimate goal, the thrust to the distant oil fields, the lifeblood of the war machine. As you moved, you noticed them, the other faces among your own, the Axis co-belligerents. You saw the Romanians, their uniforms a slightly different cut, their faces often etched with a quiet weariness. The Italians, whose easy laughter seemed out of place in this somber landscape. The Hungarians, their resolve perhaps not as unyielding as your own. They fought alongside your elite German formations, a vast, multinational force pushing into the heart of a continent. Their morale, you sensed, was often fragile. Their equipment perhaps not as formidable, but for now, you moved as one, a vast and complex machine, rolling forward under the boundless summer sky, towards a city whose name, Stalingrad, would soon become synonymous with something far colder than winter, something far more absolute than defeat. A quiet hum of anticipation, a strange blend of hope and a premonition of the unknown, settled over you as you drove deeper into the vastness of the Russian South. You feel it in your bones, the slow, insidious shift from open country to the suffocating confines of the urban battleground. The open fields, the rolling steppes. They offer space, a horizon, even in battle. But here, in Stalingrad, the world shrinks. It becomes a labyrinth of shattered concrete and twisted metal. This is the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, a grim, subterranean dance among the ruins. Every building, every cellar, every pile of rubble becomes a fortress, a kill zone. You move not in grand formations, but in small, desperate groups, your fingers tight around the cold steel of your submachine gun. The air is thick with dust, the acrid scent of gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. The sounds are sharp, immediate, the staccato bark of a submachine gun, the explosive crack of a grenade, the dull thud of a body hitting a pile of debris. You learn to move like a shadow, low to the ground, your senses heightened, every rustle, every faint whisper a potential threat. This isn't a war of sweeping maneuvers. It's a war of inches, of floors, of rooms. You find yourself in close quarters, so close you can almost smell the fear of the enemy, or feel the hot breath of your comrades. Sometimes, in the surreal silence of the night, a strange truce would fall from the depths of a cellar, where you sheltered from the bitter cold and the unseen enemy. You'd hear a call from above, from an attic held by the Soviets, a mutual, unspoken agreement to fetch the wounded, to search for a fallen comrade in the no man's land between your positions. For a fleeting moment, the war would pause, replaced by the hushed movements of men, illuminated by the distant flicker of tracer fire. But with the first pale light of dawn, the truce would shatter. The silence would be replaced by the brutal reality of bayonet charges in narrow corridors, pistol duels in cramped stairwells, the desperate, close-range combat that left no room for grand gestures, only raw survival. You learn the names of these places not from maps, but from the brutal realities they represent. Pavlov's house, a symbol of unyielding resistance, a tiny fortress holding out against relentless assaults. The towering grain silo, a brutal, multi-story killing ground where men fought upwards, floor by agonizing floor, through mountains of grain. The railway loop. They called it the tennis racket, a tangled mess of tracks and wrecked trains, a place of constant ambush and sudden death. And then, the industrial behemoths, the Red October steelworks, a skeletal ruin of immense furnaces and twisted girders, echoing with the screams of battle. The Barricadi gun factory, another shattered monument to industry, where the machinery of death now lay broken, transformed into a deadly maze. These weren't just buildings. They were characters in this grim, urban drama, each with its own story of blood and sacrifice. Every ruined block became a fortress, every pile of rubble a strategic point. The narrow, winding streets of Stalingrad rendered your heavy weapons, your tanks and artillery, almost useless. They became hulking, vulnerable targets, too cumbersome for this tight, brutal dance. This was an infantryman's war, a grinding, brutal exchange of life and death, room by agonizing room. You would clear one floor, only to find the enemy waiting on the next, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes reflecting the same weariness you felt. The fight was intimate, personal, waged with the raw tools of the soldier rifle, bayonet, grenade. But perhaps the deepest wound, you realize, was not physical. It was the psychological toll. You learned to dread the silence. Nothing compares, you'd hear the veterans whisper, their voices low and hoarse, to the silence before a fresh barrage. That quiet, that pregnant pause, when the world seemed to hold its breath, knowing what was about to descend upon you. It was in those moments, in the suffocating stillness before the storm, that the true weight of Stalingrad would settle upon your soul. A cold, heavy dread that promised only more pain. And so, you would wait, your heart thumping a frantic rhythm against your ribs, for the inevitable roar that would tear the world apart once more. As the calendar pages quietly turned from autumn's crispness to winter's biting grip, you felt the world around you harden, not just with ice, but with an unyielding despair. The cold descended, a living, breathing entity, more insidious than any enemy soldier. Temperatures plummeted, often falling below 20 degrees Celsius, turning every breath into a visible cloud, a fragile ghost against the vast, unforgiving sky. You felt it instantly, a searing pain in your lungs, a burning sensation with every inhale, as if the very air itself had turned into jagged shards of ice. Your breath would freeze on your scarf, forming delicate, crystalline patterns that soon became brittle, icy masks. The world outside transformed into a landscape of stark whites and grays. The vibrant colors of autumn muted, absorbed by the relentless cold. Even your blood, you imagined, must have thickened, turning to sludge in the shallow, frozen shell holes that pockmarked the ground. Every movement became an effort, a struggle against the suffocating embrace of the frigid air. The silence of the snow-covered ruins was often broken only by the sharp, cracking sound of ice underfoot, or the distant, mournful howl of the wind. You saw the devastating effects of the cold all around you. A silent, relentless killer. Frostbite became a common companion, a creeping numbness in your fingers and toes that quickly turned to agonizing pain, then to a terrifying blackness as the flesh died. You saw men, young and old, succumb without a single shot being fired. Their bodies found frozen solid, their faces etched with the last moments of their struggle against the cold. It wasn't just men. The horses, once majestic and strong, lay stiff and still in the snow, their breath frozen mid-exhale. Even the stray dogs, once scavenging for scraps, now curled into lifeless bundles, absorbed by the vast, white blanket. This silent, invisible enemy was as potent as any artillery barrage, slowly, inexorably, tightening its grip around your throat. The search for warmth became an obsession, a primal instinct. You learned to dig, to burrow, to create any makeshift shelter that might offer a momentary respite from the relentless chill. You saw men digging bunkers beneath frozen tram rails, their hands raw and bleeding from the effort, clawing at the unyielding ground. Others sought refuge in the massive, dark sewer pipes, some stretching for over 300 meters, their dank, chilling confines offering a false sense of security. Or you'd huddle beneath freight cars, the metallic chill seeping into your bones, but at least providing a barrier against the biting wind. These were not homes, not even temporary shelters in the true sense, but mere pockets of relative stillness, offering a fleeting illusion of safety from the crushing weight of the elements. Firewood, that most basic necessity, became a commodity more precious than gold. There was simply no fuel for your makeshift stoves, no warmth to be found. The city, once teeming with life and resources, was now a desolate wasteland, picked clean of anything that could burn. The occasional sight of a stove-heated car, a rare luxury for higher-ranking officers, would fill you with a deep, aching envy, a longing for just a moment of that blessed warmth. You learned to live with the constant, gnawing chill, a dull ache that never truly left you. This wasn't just physical discomfort. It was a profound mental strain, a slow erosion of your will. You understood the grim exchange, the quiet desperation that settled in your heart. You barter your last warmth for a crust of bread, a trade of vital energy for fleeting sustenance, a testament to the desperate choices you were forced to make in this frozen, unforgiving hell. The cold seeped not only into your bones, but into your very soul, leaving you hollowed out, waiting for an end you could not foresee. You remember the strange, unsettling calm that preceded the storm, a stillness that felt heavier than usual, even for the besieged city. It was the 19th and 20th of November, 1942. A quiet anxiety had begun to settle over your sector, a whisper of unease carried on the frigid wind. You heard the distant sounds, not quite distinct, but enough to prickle the hairs on your neck. Then, the grim news began to filter through, a chilling confirmation of your unspoken fears. The Romanian lines, stretched thin and ill-equipped on your flanks, had collapsed. The Soviet Uranus offensive, a massive, coordinated strike, had broken through with terrifying ease. It felt like a sudden, violent tearing of the fabric of your world. A vulnerability exposed where you had believed there was a shield. You were accustomed to the direct, frontal assaults. But this was different. A threat that circled, that sought to cut you off from behind. The first tangible warnings were subtle, almost ghostly. Reconnaissance flights, braving the hostile skies, began to report back, their voices tight with urgency over the crackling radios. You heard snippets of their observations factories in the distance, ablaze, their fires casting an eerie glow against the low, heavy clouds. Columns of enemy vehicles, stretching for miles, on the move, relentless, like a dark, unstoppable river. These were not the sporadic attacks you had grown used to. This was a coordinated surge, a massive movement of forces far beyond what you had anticipated. A cold dread began to seep into your heart, a premonition of something terrible, something that threatened to envelop you entirely. For a brief, desperate time, your German outposts, the small, isolated positions that guarded the outer perimeter, held their ground with grim determination. They were reinforced battalions, armed with anti-tank guns, dug in as best they could in the frozen earth. You heard the sounds of their valiant, doomed struggle, the thunder of artillery, the persistent chatter of machine guns, the desperate, defiant shouts. They managed to stave off some of the local penetrations, creating momentary traps for the advancing Soviets, buying precious, fleeting hours. But it was a delaying action, a final, futile attempt to push back an inevitable tide. The reports grew increasingly grim, the sounds of battle closer, more insistent. You knew, in your gut, that these brave stands were only slowing the inevitable, not stopping it. And then, it happened. The 23rd of November. The date would forever be etched into the collective memory of those trapped within the city. The northern and southern pincers, those relentless Soviet columns, met at Kalach, a small town that suddenly became the epicenter of your doom. In that moment, the trap was sprung. The world outside, the vast, open spaces you had once traversed with such confidence, snapped shut around you. You were sealed in. A massive force of approximately 260,000 Axis troops, confined within a pocket of land no larger than 60 by 40 kilometers. The realization dawned slowly. A sickening, gut-wrenching understanding that the world had shrunk to this desolate, frozen enclosure. Confusion reigned, a disorienting haze of disbelief and terror. From the front lines, you heard the desperate, incredulous voices of your commanders crackling over the radio, their words echoing your own stunned thoughts. "This can't be real. There aren't enough red troops," they cried out, their voices laced with a desperate denial. It seemed impossible, illogical, that such a vast army could have appeared from nowhere, encircling you so completely. You looked at the faces around you, seeing the same bewildered questions in their eyes. How could this have happened? How could the enemy have achieved such a stunning, overwhelming feat? The air itself seemed to vibrate with a silent, collective scream of disbelief. You were trapped, truly trapped. The vastness of Russia having finally closed its iron fist around you, leaving you alone in a desolate, frozen pocket, where the only certainty was the bitter cold and the unseen enemy that now surrounded you on all sides. The noose had tightened, and you felt its chilling embrace. The moment the Kessel, the cauldron, truly sealed itself around you, the world underwent a profound, immediate transformation. Water, already scarce, became a ghost, its absence a constant, nagging thirst in the back of your throat. Movement, even for the most urgent tasks, was fraught with peril. Daylight brought with it the terrifying precision of Soviet snipers. Every window, every pile of rubble, every distant shadow seemed to hold a hidden eye, a waiting rifle. You learned to move only in the protective shroud of darkness, or in quick, desperate dashes between shattered buildings, your heart pounding a frantic rhythm against your ribs. The world became a perpetual twilight, a place where light meant danger, and shadows offered the only respite. Life under bombardment became the new normal, a constant, nerve-shredding symphony of destruction. You heard it always, the constant howling of shells, a banshee's shriek tearing through the air before the earth itself erupted in a geyser of dirt and shrapnel. The ground beneath your feet vibrated with the concussive force, rattling your teeth, shaking the very foundations of your makeshift shelters. At night, the darkness would be violently punctuated by the flickers of phosphorus bombs. Brief, searing flashes of white-hot light that illuminated the shattered landscape like a demonic stage. You would see the fleeting silhouettes of ruined buildings, the twisted forms of fallen comrades, and then, just as quickly, darkness would swallow it all again, leaving behind only the acrid scent of burning chemicals and the ringing in your ears. This relentless, indiscriminate pounding eroded your spirit, leaving you perpetually on edge, waiting for the next earth-shattering impact. The most insidious enemy, however, was hunger. It began subtly, a dull ache in your stomach, a quiet yearning for something substantial. Then it grew, becoming a constant, gnawing pain that dominated every waking thought. Your rations, already meager, were cut again and again. From 80 grams of bread a day, it quickly dwindled to 50 grams, then to nothing at all. You watched as men became desperate, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and deliberate. Conserving every ounce of energy, you resorted to anything that might provide even a whisper of sustenance, a bitter, gritty concoction made from pea flour, scavenged scraps, and in the darkest, most desperate moments, whispers of cannibalism began to circulate, a horrifying testament to the depths of human deprivation. Your body became a hollow vessel, constantly demanding, constantly aching. Your mind fixated on the phantom sensation of a full stomach. The medical system, already strained, collapsed entirely under the weight of the casualties and the sheer hopelessness of the situation. Over 30,000 wounded men were crammed into damp, freezing bunkers, their groans and cries a constant, mournful chorus. There was no medicine, no proper equipment, no clean water. You saw a single surgeon, exhausted and desperate, forced to improvise abdominal and head surgeries with whatever crude tools were available. The cries of the patients echoing in the confined space. Infections spread like wildfire. Frostbite turned gangrenous, and the wounded died. Not from their initial injuries, but from the brutal conditions, the lack of care, and the gnawing hunger. It was a hell within a hell, a place where suffering multiplied with every passing hour. The command structure, once so clear and unyielding, began to shatter. Older support troops, men whose lives had been spent in the safety of logistics or administration, were suddenly drafted into infantry roles, given a rifle and told to fight. They were ill-equipped, ill-trained for the brutal realities of urban combat. Their faces a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Replacements, when they miraculously arrived, were often untrained, thrown into the meat grinder with little preparation. The chain of command frayed, the voices of authority losing their resonance against the deafening roar of the battle. You saw the growing despair in the eyes of your officers, the quiet resignation as they faced the impossible task of leading men who were starving, freezing, and dying, trapped in a shrinking pocket, with no hope of escape. The Kessel had truly become a cage, and you were its captive, witnessing the slow, agonizing disintegration of everything you had known. You feel the weight of it. The chilling certainty that your fate is being decided not by the desperate reality on the ground, but by distant voices, by a mind far removed from the cold, the hunger, the relentless bombardment. It began with Hitler's hedgehog position decree, a chilling command that reverberated through the frozen airwaves. General Paulus, your commander, had made repeated, desperate pleas, his voice strained with the urgency of your predicament. He had begged for the freedom to maneuver, to break out of this suffocating trap, to save the men under his command. But each plea was met with an unyielding refusal. The order from the Führer was absolute. Stand fast. There would be no retreat, no breakout, no escape. You were to hold your ground, like a hedgehog bristling its spines, a defiant, unmoving presence in the face of overwhelming odds. It was an order rooted in ideology, not in tactical reality, and you felt its crushing burden. Then, in a bitter, almost cruel irony, came the news of Paulus's promotion to Field Marshal. You heard the whispers, saw the grim smiles. It was an honor, perhaps, but one bestowed on a man condemned. A golden chain forged around his neck. The elevation felt hollow. A desperate attempt to shore up morale, to demand continued sacrifice from a man who now carried the weight of hundreds of thousands of lives on his shoulders, all while being denied the means to save them. The moral dilemma must have been agonizing. A silent battle raging within him, obedience to the Führer, or the desperate human urge to preserve the lives of his men. You could only imagine the torment, the silent screams of a commander trapped between an impossible order and the grim reality of his dying army. There were whispers, of course, of failed breakout plans, tantalizing glimpses of a different fate that might have been. You heard the hushed instructions, the orders to destroy non-essentials, to lighten your loads, to prepare for a westward push that would tear you free from the Soviet embrace. A flicker of hope, brief and fragile, would ignite in your starved eyes. You would strip away what little you had, making ready for a desperate charge. But then, the orders would change, reversed by a higher command, or simply fade into silence. The westward push never came. You were forced back, retreating into the very same demolished positions you had momentarily evacuated, back into the familiar landscape of rubble and death. Each false hope was a deeper cut, each reversal a heavier blow to your already fragile morale. The mental anguish you sensed was not limited to Paulus. Your junior officers, the men who fought alongside you, shared the burden of this impossible situation. They were torn, caught between the sacred duty of obeying the Führer's direct orders and the stark, agonizing reality of saving their men's lives. You saw it in their faces, the lines of worry, the dark circles under their eyes, the way they would sometimes look at you, their gaze holding a profound regret. How do you lead men to their certain death, knowing there might have been another way? How do you demand continued sacrifice when all hope has been extinguished by a distant, unfeeling command? This wasn't just a battle against the Soviets. It was a battle against the crushing weight of an ideology that valued defiance over life. A battle against the slow, agonizing erosion of human will, leaving you utterly helpless, adrift in a sea of impossible choices. The orders from above, meant to provide direction, instead became the invisible chains that bound you tighter to this frozen hell. The rumble was a sound that made every man pause, lifting their heads, their eyes searching the desolate, gunmetal sky. It was the sound of the Ju-52 transport planes, a fragile lifeline attempting to pierce the impenetrable Soviet ring. You clung to the hope they represented, these distant silver birds, bringing the promise of sustenance, of ammunition, of life itself. Each sortie, over 90 of them attempting to break through the impenetrable flak fire, was a desperate gamble against the overwhelming odds. You would watch, your breath held tight in your chest as they braved the storms of anti-aircraft fire, their engines a hopeful drone in the otherwise silent, watchful sky. They carried not just bread, but bullets, Bren gun ammo, precious morphine for the wounded, a desperate inventory of necessities that represented the difference between life and death. The strips where they attempted to land were nightmares themselves. Places like Pomnik, Gumrak, Stalingradsky. They weren't proper airfields, but crater-strewn patches of frozen earth, constantly shelled by Soviet fighters and artillery. You could hear the distant roar of dogfights, the angry chatter of machine guns as the Soviet pilots tried to swat down these lumbering transport planes. Every landing was a miracle, every takeoff a perilous escape. The planes would often skid, their tires biting into the icy ground, their wings sometimes clipped by hidden obstacles or shell holes. Yet, they kept coming, a testament to the courage of the pilots, or perhaps to a desperate, unyielding command. But even when the supplies arrived, chaos often followed. You saw it with your own eyes. The planes would open their cargo doors, sometimes still in the air, a desperate attempt to get the supplies out before being shot down. The bundles would tumble from the sky, sometimes landing perfectly, more often lost in the swirling dust storms, disappearing into the vast, white landscape. And then, the desperate scramble on the ground. Starving troops, their hunger a raw, undeniable force, would rush the landing zones, sometimes looting supplies mid-airdrop, a frantic, every man for himself frenzy. The scenes were brutal. Men fighting over a sack of bread, a box of ammunition, their desperation overriding any sense of order or discipline. What little arrived was often distributed unevenly or lost entirely, a cruel tease of salvation that never quite materialized. The return journeys were even more perilous, a grim reversal of fortune. Each aircraft, those slow, vulnerable transports, could evacuate only a handful of men, perhaps 8 wounded soldiers, their bodies broken, their faces pale with shock and cold. They would be crammed into the unheated cabins, enduring sub-zero winds, their lives hanging by a thread as the plane clawed its way back into the hostile sky. You would see them loaded, the stretcher bearers moving with grim efficiency, knowing that for every man flown out, hundreds, thousands remained, condemned to the freezing hell. It was a cruel lottery, a momentary reprieve for a lucky few, while the vast majority were left behind to face the inevitable. Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised a lifeline, a daily delivery of 350 tons of supplies, enough to sustain the trapped army. It was a promise that echoed with the emptiness of a desolate plain. You heard the figures, the grand pronouncements, but the reality was a stark, brutal contrast. The target was met on only 3 days in December, a fleeting moment of adequacy in a month of profound scarcity. The weather, a capricious and relentless enemy, often grounded the plains, shrouding the city in thick fog or blizzards, and the Soviet fighters, ever vigilant, ever aggressive, made the rest impossible. The air bridge, meant to be your salvation, became a desperate trickle, a constant reminder of the world's indifference, leaving you shivering in the cold, your stomach empty, your hope dwindling with every passing, unfulfilled day. The sky, once a symbol of freedom, now seemed only to mock your plight. You remember the biting cold of Christmas Eve, 1942, a stark contrast to the warmth and light of every Christmas you had ever known. Yet, in the heart of this frozen hell, a fragile flicker of humanity managed to ignite. On a frozen platform, amidst the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling railway station, a spontaneous Christmas tree appeared. It was meager, perhaps a few frozen branches salvaged from the ruins, but it was there, adorned with whatever scraps could be found, its meager candles burning with a defiant glow against the overwhelming darkness. Around it, a quiet gathering formed a mix of wounded men, their bandages stark against their pale faces, and unwounded soldiers, their uniforms caked with mud and dust. In hushed, cracked voices, you heard the familiar melody of Silent Night rise into the freezing air. It was a fragile, poignant sound, carrying the weight of all the Christmases past, all the homesick yearning for warmth, comfort, and peace. For a brief, precious moment, hope flickered, a tiny ember in the concrete shell of Stalingrad. It was a glimpse of something pure, something untouched by the brutality of war. You felt a shared sense of humanity, a quiet communion with the men around you, strangers bound by an unbearable common experience. The faint light of the candles reflected in their eyes, mirroring your own profound longing for a life that seemed impossibly far away. But as quickly as it came, the moment receded. With the first pale light of dawn, the bombardment began anew, tearing through the fragile peace, dragging you back into the brutal reality of the Kessel. The dream dissolved, leaving behind only the cold, the hunger, and the persistent roar of the artillery. Your thoughts drifted, unbidden, to home. You clutched the precious, crinkled letters from your parents, their words a faded echo of love and concern. You imagined the warmth of your pipe smoke parlor, the gentle comfort of a familiar armchair, the scent of wood smoke and baking bread. You closed your eyes and saw the faces of loved ones, their smiles bright, their laughter clear. These were not mere memories. They were vital lifelines, fragile anchors in a world that sought to strip away every shred of comfort and familiarity. They were dreams that offered a momentary escape, a fleeting glimpse of a world that still existed, far beyond the reach of the bombs and the cold. Amidst the shared misery, there were small, desperate acts of kindness. A comrade might offer you a Christmas tree, a cotton swab soaked in precious morphine, a brief oblivion from the agony of a wound, a narcotic gift in a world devoid of comfort. You might receive a sliver of a half bar of chocolate, its taste a sudden explosion of sweetness, a reminder of forgotten luxuries, perhaps a sip of champagne, salvaged from some shattered cellar, its bubbles a fleeting, surreal contrast to the grit and grime that coated your tongue. These were not generous gifts. They were tokens of desperate compassion, shared among men who knew they might not see another dawn. Each offering was a silent acknowledgement of the suffering, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of shared pain. And in the depths of your heart, a grim, undeniable knowledge began to settle. You understood that the relief efforts, the grand promises from distant commanders, were stalling. The air bridge was failing. The outside world was not coming for you, not truly. This wasn't a temporary hardship. This was a descent into the inevitable. The silent songs of Christmas Eve faded into the roar of the guns. and the fragile hope extinguished itself in the biting winds. You were left with only the cold, the hunger, and the stark, unwavering certainty that you were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The city had become your tomb, and Christmas, a bitter reminder of all that had been lost and all that was yet to come. The new year, 1943, brought not a fresh start, but a renewed, crushing offensive. You felt the earth tremble with the Soviet ring of steel offensives, a relentless, tightening grip around your shrinking pocket. The sounds of battle, once omnipresent, now grew even more deafening, more insistent. The perimeter, once vast, was now a fraction of its size, shrinking with every agonizing hour. You could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting, as if the entire weight of the Soviet army was pressing down upon you. There was no room left to maneuver, no space left to breathe. The most terrifying silence, you realized, was not the quiet before a barrage, but the quiet of your own weapons, ammunition, the very lifeblood of your defense, began to run out. Your anti-tank guns, once formidable, stood silent, their barrels cold and useless. The artillery, your mighty voice in the battle, fell silent, piece by agonizing piece. The thunder that had been your constant companion, your only means of striking back, faded into a terrifying absence. All that remained were hand grenades, pathetic pebbles against a landslide, and the cold steel of your bayonet, a grim, intimate tool for a desperate, final stand. The world became quieter, save for the persistent, triumphant roar of the Soviet guns, their shells tearing into your last strongholds with impunity. You were defenseless, awaiting the inevitable. Then came the radio calls, desperate and fraught with a strange mixture of hope and resignation. Paulus's voice, once resolute, now carried a plea, a final, agonizing request for permission to surrender, to save what little remained. You heard the command, the impossible order. Hold on, I'll get you out. A hollow promise that mocked your reality, but then the reversal. The final, agonizing decision. The radio crackled with hushed instructions, a ceasefire. And then, the sight that you thought you would never see, white flags, fluttering in the cold wind, raised in the ruined cellars, in the shattered windows of the last standing buildings. A strange, eerie silence descended, a peace heavier than any war. You saw your comrades, men you had fought with, bled with, shared your last crusts of bread with, slowly emerge from their holes, their hands raised, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a profound, bone-deep despair. February 2nd, 1943. The date etched itself into your memory, the day of capitulation. Entire divisions, shattered and broken, but still alive, were marched out of the city. You were part of them. A silent, shuffling column of defeated men, your boots crunching on the frozen ground. You passed through the ruins of Stalingrad, a city you had fought for, bled for, nearly died in. Now a skeletal monument to your defeat. The air was still, save for the whispers of the wind and the quiet, heavy shuffle of thousands of weary feet. You were alive, but broken, your spirit wounded in ways that might never heal. The aftershock was immediate, a chilling follow-up to the nightmare of the Kessel. Over 100,000 Axis prisoners of war, a vast, defeated army, were marched east. The journey was not a merciful one. Disease, rampant among the starving and weakened men, spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, the cold, and the unrelenting hunger turned the march into a death march. You saw men collapse, their bodies too weak to continue, left behind in the snow. The whispers of cannibalism, once a horrifying rumor in the Kessel, now became a grim reality for some in the desperate columns. This was not the end. It was the beginning of another, even more brutal, chapter of suffering. A testament to the unforgiving nature of war and the cruel indifference of those who inflicted it. The world had swallowed you whole, and now it was slowly, agonizingly, digesting you. You are one of the fortunate few, one of the incredibly rare souls who survived that long, agonizing journey into the depths of the Soviet Union. The death marches continued, mile after brutal mile, across the vast, indifferent landscape. You remember the names, or rather, the sounds of them. Bekovka, Bauer, No Man. Places that became synonymous with unimaginable suffering. In these camps, a silent genocide unfolded. Over 30,000 men perished each month, succumbing to the ravages of typhus, dysentery, starvation, and the relentless cold. You saw men, once strong and vibrant, reduced to skeletal figures, their eyes hollow with despair. The accounts of cannibalism, once whispers, now solidified into chilling truths. A horrifying testament to the absolute desperation that gripped those trapped within the barbed wire. The scale of the suffering was so vast, so profound, that it almost defied comprehension. Of the hundreds of thousands captured, only a precious few, a mere 6,000 men, ever returned home. You were among them, forever marked by the ordeal, a ghost of your former self. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, that grand, unshakable belief in your own might, was shattered forever in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. It was not just a defeat. It was an annihilation of spirit, a profound lesson etched in blood and ice. The world would remember the numbers, the grand strategic turning point, but you would carry the personal cost, the weight of the men who never returned. Their faces, not figures, haunted your sleep. You carried their stories, their final whispers, their unspoken pleas. You remember the letters, the desperate cries of the survivors, urging the world, urging future generations. Remember us, sons of Stalingrad. Not as statistics in a history book, not as nameless casualties, but as individuals, fathers, brothers, young boys who had been thrust into a frozen hell beyond comprehension. Their voices, carried on the wind, through the years, demanded to be heard, to be honored not in triumph, but in the quiet remembrance of their sacrifice. The legacy of Stalingrad, you came to understand, was immense, reaching far beyond the shattered walls of the city. It was the turning point on the Eastern Front, the moment the seemingly unstoppable German momentum finally broke. The tide of war shifted, irrevocably, to the Red Army. Their victory a testament to their unyielding resilience and the sheer scale of their sacrifice. The balance of power tilted, and the world would never be the same. The city itself, a symbol of industrial might, became instead a symbol of human endurance, of the brutal cost of war, and of the profound changes that echoed across a continent. And as you reflect now, in the quiet of a moment, far removed from the howling shells and the biting winds, you understand the true meaning of it all. We weren't statistics. The echoes of voices whisper from the past. We were fathers, brothers, young boys in a frozen hell. You carry their stories, their pain, their enduring spirit. You carry the memory of the cold, the hunger, the fear, but also the fleeting moments of shared humanity, the quiet acts of courage, the unyielding will to survive. The weight of Stalingrad will forever remain with you, a silent testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even at its breaking point. And perhaps, in sharing these whispers, in bearing witness to the unvarnished truth, the memory of those who fell and those who survived will continue to echo, softly, like the distant wind over a field of snow, for generations to come. In 1938, Adolf Hitler seized what legend said was history's most powerful weapon. If you hold it, you're invincible. It was said to be the spear which pierced the side of Christ. Military leaders became almost besotted with the idea of possessing it. And with the spear in his grasp, Hitler unleashed terror upon the world. But in the chaos of war, this most valuable of Europe's treasures simply vanished. This was an emblem of war, twisted by the Nazis to become symbols of the Third Reich. But one man, Walter Horn, would uncover the mystery of what had happened to the Spear of Destiny. And one of America's finest generals, obsessed with the spear, would launch a mission to find it. 1933. Adolf Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany. Hitler was by no means a normal person to be leading a country in the middle of Europe, in the middle of the 20th century, and especially one the size of Germany. He was a very embittered, lonely, twisted, abnormal individual who had an enormous amount of drive and this famous will to power him. And that's what really, spurred him on. He is desperate to be the all-powerful leader of the German people and create a new Germanic empire. The trouble is, he had won less than half of the popular vote. His grip on power was nothing like as strong as many people think. I mean, after all, most people hadn't voted for Hitler. The country is divided, and to realize his dreams, he will need to unite it. Germany was, until just a few years before, in real terms, just a collection of very, very small states. You've got people in, all up near the Danish border, and you've got people all the way down near Munich and as far east into what would now be part of Poland. So, how do you unify these people? Hitler encourages the Germans to look to what he says is their past. He wants to portray himself as a man who will restore Germany to a time when it ruled Europe. And he wants to extend its borders to those of the greatest German empire in history, the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire was first created by Charlemagne Charles the Great, the Germanic king of the Franks, in 800 AD. Its purpose to spread Christianity through all of Europe for 1,000 years. It dominated the continent at its height, stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean and ruling over what is now Germany and much of Austria, Poland, Italy, and France. Now Hitler wanted to create an even greater empire in his own image. A 1,000-year Nazi Reich with himself at its head. He wasn't the type of person who would like to cut deals and engage in the art of statesmanship or diplomacy. This is a man who just wanted to drive things forward the way he saw the world should be in his eyes. But Hitler's difficulty is that there is nothing imperial about him as the son of a working-class Austrian civil servant. It is not enough to simply proclaim himself the German Führer. He needs to look like one. He needed to try and assimilate some of the trappings of power and the type of trappings that would be suitable for someone who is ruling a kingdom in the middle of Europe. And of course, what's he going to do? He's going to look back to history to find these things. He decided that to be an emperor, he would need the possessions of an emperor. Hitler was looking for an emblem that would underpin his claim to be leading the German people back to a new era. What do we need? Well, we need various items that are associated with other people in power. The Holy Roman emperors had held crown jewels as symbols of their authority. An imperial crown, a scepter, and an orb. But of all these symbols of past German glory, one is more important than all the others. It looks like a simple Roman spearhead. It is the Spear of Destiny. The Spear of Destiny was said to be none other than the spear that had pierced the side of Jesus Christ as he hung on the cross. The myth said that it was wielded by a Roman centurion, called Longinus, as the legend is told. Longinus was a Roman centurion who'd served Pilate faithfully, and it got cataracts. He was going blind, and Pilate pulled him out of the ranks because he was no longer of service as a fighter and gave him relative easy duty, you at Mount Calvary, you know, making sure the crucifixions went off as planned and didn't require a lot of fighting, didn't require great eyesight. The Bible says that this centurion, when inspecting the crucified men, was unsure if Jesus had died, so he thrust his spear into Christ's sight. Blood allegedly dripped down the side of the spear into Longinus's eyes. He was cured of cataracts. He was cured of his blindness. He had a vision of the future. He had a vision of Jesus as the Messiah. Longinus was converted instantly, as Christianity spreads throughout the world. Longinus' spear, touched by the Son of God, became a revered holy relic. The spear was passed down first through a succession of Roman emperors, and then to Charlemagne. Charlemagne carries it into battle. He's invincible. As long as it's in his hands, it becomes known as a talisman. For conquerors, for military force, it is a military image that it has of vanquishing foes. Such was its mystique that every Holy Roman emperor after Charlemagne wanted to possess it. It became a symbol of their authority, the spear at a very early point in history. His is a reflection of power, of strength. Legend says that whoever held the spear would be undefeated in battle. So not only do you get a sense of whoever has this is the true world monarch because he has it. But if you hold it, you're invincible. It was clear why Hitler wanted it, but he didn't have it. In fact, it was in Vienna, the capital of neighboring Austria. When the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved in 1806, its heirs, the Habsburgs, moved the spear to Austria, where it ended up on display in the Hofburg Palace, and it was here in 1908 that Adolf Hitler, then a struggling Austrian painter, had first seen the spear and begun to covet it. According to one version of the story, Hitler had actually seen the spear in the museum there. And, apparently he may have had some sort of moment of epiphany in which he realized that this was an incredibly important object. And he had been sort of touched by it. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. The point was, it was regarded as being important. Hitler had long known where it was, and now he was German Führer. All he had to do was take it on. March the 12th, 1938. German troops crossed the border into Austria. The world watched as the Austrian government collapsed. Hitler was killing two birds with one stone. He was reclaiming lands once held by the Roman Empire and was now on the brink of seizing the Spear of Destiny. Got to realize that Austria and Germany are, in Hitler's eyes, indivisible, and indeed, they should never have been defined in the first place with Austria in his grasp. Hitler now activated the second part of his plan, to seize the spear as the story is told. As the panzers were driving, across the border into Austria, Hitler had an SS officer in civilian garb already planted in the museum. When he was alerted that the border had been crossed, he changed into his uniform, pulled out his gun, and stood guard over those crown jewels. Nobody was to touch them until Hitler arrived. Hitler arrived in Vienna just 2 days after the invasion. One of the very first things he does is to go to the Habsburg Museum. Go to the display case where the spear and crown jewels are and opens it and takes possession of the spear. He took hold of the spear on March the 15th. It was not a date picked by accident. He took the Spear of Destiny on St. Linus Day. That's when the centurion, who allegedly carried it at the crucifixion, is honored. Hitler took the spear to the southern German city of Nuremberg, which had been its home for centuries during the reign of the Holy Roman Emperors. There was absolutely no question where Hitler was going to take the spear. once he absconded with it from Austria, was going to take it back to Nuremberg, back to its spiritual home. What was to be the spiritual headquarters? The spiritual capital of Nazism, of the Thousand-Year Reich, taking his lead from the Holy Roman Empire. Hitler had decided to place Nuremberg at the center of his new Nazi Reich. Berlin is the brain. Nuremberg is the heart. Here he had built vast parade grounds, holding hundreds of thousands of spectators. He staged enormous rallies, showcasing German military might. Extravagant displays presented the German people with an image of the future based on his vision of the past. We see newsreels today of the parades going through the streets in Nuremberg, of soldiers dressed as medieval knights with mock-ups of the chest of the crown. Jewels symbolic of being returned to the homeland, the Thousand-Year Reich begins by displaying the spear and the crown jewels. His message could not have been any clearer. Hey, he was the heir to the Holy Roman Emperors. It was as if King Arthur had finally gotten Excalibur and was marching through town with it, and in a triumphal parade. I've got it with the spear of destiny in his possession. Hitler was convinced he would be unstoppable in his aim to conquer the rest of Europe. But of course, it didn't turn out that way. Heat. By the beginning of 1945, 5 years of war has devastated Europe. The spear has failed to bring Hitler the victory he had dreamed of. His ambitions lie in tatters, his empire on the brink of collapse and in the chaos. The spear of destiny, one of the great treasures of Europe, has disappeared. But on an American army base in Belgium, pure luck will allow one man to track it down. Walter Horn is a lieutenant in the U.S. Third Army, his mission to interrogate German prisoners of war. Horn is no ordinary American GI. For one thing, he's German, and 10 years earlier he had narrowly escaped the clutches of the SS in the 1930s. Horn was at university in Heidelberg, southwest Germany. His passion art history, his specialty, was the relics of the Holy Roman Empire. He was an art history major who just had the misfortune to get his doctoral degree in 1933. Just as Adolf Hitler had come to power as a historian, Horn found himself being sucked into Hitler's obsession with proving the superiority of the German race. He was invited to join a special unit of the SS. Created specifically for this purpose, the Arnonurba promising academics were press-ganged into the Arnona, the job to prove at any cost that German culture was superior to every culture in the world. And who better for the Arnonurba to recruit than the impressive young academic and PhD, Walter Horn. Walter was perfect Nazi material. He had been a javelin contender for the Olympics. He came from fifth-generation Germanic Aryan stock. You know, he was young, he was good-looking, he was well-raveled. This was the kind of man the Nazis were looking for. But Horn could see exactly where Nazi control of German academic life was leading. The Arnonurba can't just be seen as a kind of harmless bunch of corrupted academics who were just sucking up the Nazis, because what they were proving was helping to create a worldview that was, in essence, evil. And some of these theories are directly related to the idea of race. And we all know what happens when you apply these theories to a regime that is as murderous as the Nazis are. It leads directly to the gates of Auschwitz. Horn wanted no part of it. So in 1934, he decided to flee Germany. He didn't want to give up his homeland, but he saw no option around it. One thing he knew is he had to get out of Germany. You know, the storm is coming down. This is no place to be. But as he began his flight to freedom, Horn learned that the SS were after him. He was very concerned. He hated the Nazis. He didn't know if it was because of remarks that he had made about the Nazis. To his horror, one SS officer had managed to track him down. The SS officer had his pistol, and I'm sure Walter was thinking that the end had come, but Horn was in for yet another surprise. The SS officer essentially, told him, "Yes, we're looking for people like you, but good luck, just don't come back." Walter Horn eventually managed to escape via Italy and then Cuba to America, where he became a naturalized American citizen. And that is how, as a fluent German speaker, he ended up in Belgium interrogating PS at the tail end of the war as the Allied armies worked their way into Germany. Behind the front lines, you've got units doing various sort of ancillary roles that are nevertheless vitally important. One of these, of course, is to hunt for criminals. I mean straight manhunts, and what these people are doing. These war crimes units is to hunt for evidence, which hasn't been burnt by the Gestapo for months. Horn had been uncovering very little. But one afternoon, a harmless-looking pea changed all that. Quite late in the day, relative old man is taken out of the prisoner pen to be interrogated, Private. Fritz Huber. Fritz Huber has nothing really to contribute, or so it seems. Private Huber said. I'm sorry I can't tell you any information because I don't know any information. All I've been doing is, slowing gun cases around. Walter felt sorry for him, offered him a cigarette, offered him a cup of coffee, and they just sat and chatted. Then Huber revealed something that would blow Walter Horn's mind. Hubert said, I do know of a special treasure, a hidden treasure. Are you at all interested in art history? Little could Huber have known the man he was talking to had a doctorate in art history. There wasn't anything in the world Walter wanted to hear more about, than art and antiques. Huber began to tell Horn about a Nazi treasure trove hidden beneath Nuremberg Castle, one which supposedly contained any number of priceless pieces of art. Horn listened intently as Huber listed the sort of items that any imaginary pirate hoard might contain. Huber was describing various treasures, which could have been any kind of depositories, because we know the Nazis looted, major museums. But this collection was different. He described a scepter. He described a crown. He described a golden orb, what they call, the world orb of Christianity. And then he said, that's a spear. It's a spearhead. Roman spearhead. And of course, Walter knew instantly the collection. There was no question what it was he was describing. The crown jewels of the Holy Roman Empire and the Spear of Destiny. Horn pushed Cuba for every detail and was amazed to find out the lengths that the Nazis had gone to protect the Spear of Destiny. Huber said his father had been hired by the head of the Nazi SS, Heinrich Himmler, to install a ventilation system in a hidden vault beneath Nuremberg Castle. And oh, by the way, my mother goes in once a week to check on the treasures that are kept in this vault. She has to check the humidity, check against insects. My mother's got to wear white gloves. And as Huber is telling this story, Walter's getting more and more interested. Huber described a network of tunnels beneath the castle, which led out to a secret entrance on the streets below. It looked like an active, ongoing antique shop, and it had two doors for bringing items in and out. But of course, it was Nazis who were going the in and out, aware that he had possibly just uncovered the location of one of the world's great treasures. Horn immediately began to write up a report for his superiors. But fearing the American High Command wouldn't understand the importance of the spear, Horn made sure to write in detail, even drawing a map of the city to show where the bolt could be found. Walter Horn sat at a borrowed typewriter, and he typed up an intelligence report, and of course, being an art historian, I'm sure it reads more like an art history paper than a military intelligence report. Horn worked quickly. He knew the advancing Allied forces were planning a huge offensive on Nuremberg, and he feared that in the battle the spear could be destroyed. He mailed it off fully, thinking that this would be dismissed as tangential to the fighting going on. That what military commander would possibly conceive the Holy Roman Empire, crown jewels, and the Spear of Destiny to be a military objective. But in another amazing stroke of luck, Horn's report eventually landed on the desk of the one man who had both the power and the will to save the spear. General George S. Patton, also known as Old Blood and Guts, was in command of the U.S. Third Army in Europe and was one of the generals overseeing the invasion of Germany. A flamboyant man often pictured with 2 silver revolvers. He was a brilliant tank commander and tactician, a Catholic convert. Patton saw himself as a Christian warrior, but more than that, he too was obsessed with the legend of the Spear of Destiny. He had even written a poem about what it must have felt like to plunge the spear into the side of Christ. I cannot name my battles, for the visions are not clear yet. I see the twisted faces, and I feel the rending spear. Perhaps I stabbed our Savior in his sacred, helpless side. Yet I have called his name in blessing, when after times I died, as U.S. troops battled their way across Europe. Patton had been attempting to track the spear's movements. His fear was that the spear, if not found, might be used as a talisman to inspire a Nazi resurgence. But so far, he had no idea where the spear was until Walter Horn's report landed on his desk. Lo and behold, that's exactly what Patton was looking for. And he found it in that intelligence report, Light bulb went off. This was a military objective for Patton on the eve of the assault on Nuremberg. Patton took an amazing decision. He ensured that a cracked team of soldiers were sent to locate the secret vault. But it would be no easy task. Nuremberg had suffered a series of massive bombing raids. Thousands had died, hundreds of thousands displaced. They talk about the devastation in Dresden, but the devastation in Dresden essentially came from a fire that spread in Nuremberg. It was literally from the tons and tons of bombs. And now the Allies intended to send Hitler a message. They planned to capture Nuremberg on April the 20th. The furious birthday, Hitler was adamant that his spiritual capital would not fall. His instructions are that the defenders of Nuremberg will fight to the last bullet and the last man, and even the last young child. On April the 16th, the U.S. Army began a fight to the death for the city. Patton's special unit sent to locate the spear was soon caught in the thick of the fighting. It was narrow medieval streets, big battlements. It was almost essentially hand-to-hand combat, almost like taking one street after another, and it was very dangerous. Kind of fighting children were actually being used as scouts. The Germans fought right down, virtually, to the last man standing in the chaos of the battle. Patton's unit, armed with Horn's men, embarked on their dangerous mission to locate the secret vault. That unit lost many men to work their way where the vault was when they got there. They couldn't even find it. There had been such devastation, so many bombings, and they weren't even sure that they gotten to the location. But then they made a discovery. One of them found a crevice, a sort of tunnel-like thing, and they dropped in at the end of a long, dark, underground tunnel. They found something staggering set into thick concrete. A steel vault door, 8 feet high and 12 in thick. But there was a problem. The giant vault doors were locked shut. Door itself was impenetrable at that point, when one of the munitions men was literally about to, plug dynamite in the sides of this giant vault door. But just moments before the charges were detonated, a German civilian came forward and stopped the munitions. Luckily, he was stopped at the last minute because, God knows what might have happened to the contents inside a German who, a representative, the mayor of Nuremberg, gave the Allies the combination of this vault, he said. Please, don't blow this up. Very special things here, and they opened the vault behind the giant. The GIS discovered a vast and incredibly sophisticated underground complex. This had to be the vault that the prisoner Huber had described, but it was on a scale beyond anything they had imagined. Commissioned by Heinrich Himmler, it was an enormous expansion of old beer cellars beneath the Nuremberg castle. Himmler secretly sent in teams of teams of builders to reconfigure this beer cellar into a high-tech vault, and I don't use that term. High-tech loosely, foot-thick, reinforced steel special locking mechanisms. The walls were lined with various materials to keep the moisture out. Air purification system, its own generator system. It had water. It had showers. It had baths. It had a kitchen. It had its own little escape hatch. You could have a team of people living in there for months at a time. The GIS could hardly believe what they had found, but unsure of exactly what they had discovered. The message was sent for Horn to come to Nuremberg to identify the contents of the vault. When Horn arrived, he was shocked by the state of this once beautiful medieval city picture, a moonscape picture. Churches missing their bodies strewn about. Horn was led to the vault. Even though the contents had been described to him by Huba, Horn was stunned by what the vaults contained. There is just this fantastic room full of Europe's treasure, which can rival anything you'll see in the Louvre or the British Museum, and it really is a real treasure trove. And the guys who went in there realized, my God. I mean, how much had the Nazis taken, you know? Every box was just full of something more and more incredible. Horn was shown a small wooden crate in it. Unmistakable to Horn's expert eyes was the Spear of Destiny. Horn became a hero when he recovered his Spear of Destiny. Now the question was, what were they to do with him? May 1945. The Allies declare victory over Hitler's Nazi regime. 6 years of war draws to a close. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. The Allies uncovered millions of dollars worth of Europe's finest treasures, stolen by the Nazis. We know the Nazis looted, Major museums, major collections were brought wholesale in by train. Now began the task of returning these treasures to their rightful owners. Walter Horn had assumed the spear would be returned to Austria, his Spear of Destiny. Come from the Hofburg in a museum in Vienna, this is where he fully thought they would be returned to Patton. Had other ideas, it seemed that Patton too had become bewitched by the power of the Spear of Destiny, Patton said, and openly declared that these relics, this Spear of Destiny, are not artwork. These are emblems of war, twisted by the Nazis to become symbols of the Third Reich. Patton was the type of man who very much would have liked the idea of the Spear of Destiny, in his back pocket, and wanted to take it back to the United States. Perhaps he believed, as did Hitler, that, whoever possessed his spear would be invincible. So adamant was Patton on having the spear that Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of all Allied troops in Europe, had to intervene. A huge argument broke out between these two iconic figures. But before it could be resolved, tragedy struck his car, is hit by a lorry. He's virtually paralyzed, is in hospital for a short period, and then he dies. With Patton died, the last obstacle to the spear returning home to Vienna. Special plane was dispatched under a very heavy armed guard, because these are, considered the most valuable treasures that the Nazis had ever looted. And there was a special return ceremony in Austria, and today they're back in the museum, essentially, in the same room, in the same part of the museum where they were when Hitler took them. But there remains one outstanding question. What was this item that Walter Horn had recovered, and that so many people had fought and died for? Could it really be the spear that Charlemagne held, the very spear that pierced Christ's side? Robert Feather, a trained metallurgist, was the first person in 40 years to be allowed to examine the sphere. Scientifically, I was called in to examine the sphere because I'd had previous experience of metallurgical work on ancient artifacts. I trained as a metallurgist, and I've sort of done a lot of work in ancient metals and materials. One of the first tests he did was to see if there were traces of blood on the spear. If it were Christ's blood, it would be the most staggering discovery of all time. I took swabs of the spear just in case there was any biological material. I mean, if it's a spear, it could have had some blood on it somewhere, and the remotest chance that some of it might be Jesus' blood just occurred. So I thought better do it just in case. Is someone going to say, "Why didn't you?" But no traces of blood could be found. Next, he did a series of non-destructive tests to uncover the age of the spear. We did XRF, which is X-ray fluorescent tests. We did microscopic analysis. We did full high-houred X-ray analysis. These tests finally gave an approximate date to the spear itself, the 7th or 8th century AD. To say that it was a spear that went into the side of Jesus, I think is rather difficult, if not virtually impossible. It's impossible really to have had much contact with someone who has supposedly died 8 centuries before it was made. Science had proven that the Vienna lance was not the spear that had pierced the side of Christ. So does this mean it is worthless? had thousands of lives being risked in pursuit of nothing more than a medieval forgery. After all, one uncomfortable fact, even for Hitler, was that it wasn't the only spear claiming to be the spear of destiny. Problem with the spear is that there are quite a few of them. I think there are at least 4. There are competitor spears in different places. To the Vienna spear, there's one in Etsy in Armenia. It doesn't look very much like a spear, and it's more rather like a Roman bannerhead. But nevertheless, they revere it. And there's another one in Poland, which is almost certainly a replica, middle-aged reproduction. There's another one in St. Peter's, in the Basilica of St. Peter's, which is said to be part of the spear that pierced the side of Jesus. But it seems that the spear Hitler coveted had a value that none of the others had. We know more about the early history of the Vienna spear than any of the others, and we can trace it certainly in written record back to the 8th century. That date is extremely significant. It was when Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, was rising to power. This spear may not have been the spear which pierced Christ's side, but it was the spear held by the Holy Roman Emperors. There's no question that that spear was the one carried by the Holy Roman Emperors, and that this was the one passed on, throughout history, through tradition, and was the one that Hitler took, and Hitler had understood something else. It doesn't matter what something is. What matters is what people believe it to be. For centuries, the spear had been revered by the most powerful rulers of Europe, and that for Hitler was enough to make it something worth having. Doesn't really matter whether this was the spear that was shoved into the side of Jesus. It doesn't matter. It's what people think is what matters. It's what people choose to believe. The fact that it doesn't date back to the crucifixion doesn't make it, to my mind, any less valuable, because what it represents in the larger sense is what's important. Even though it's very easy today to look at it as all being part of, it's all mumbo-jumbo. It's kind of, junk history. It's kind of mythology. It's superstition. It's important.